So, all right, let me see. Okay, man. I'm trying to think how I should do this. So today I have um, Anthony David Vernon.
Hello.
Did I say that right?
Yes, you did. That is my name.
And this is the honestly the first time I'm interviewing
Thank you for
someone, but
having me.
let's see how it goes. No worries, man. Actually, the topic of your book is really fascinating. I think it has a significance for culture. But
Nice. Thank you.
so first things first. Um, Tell me how you came to write this book. Like, how did it start?
So the
Like you were going about your day and then what occurred to you?
Yeah, so well, it wasn't going about just a normal day. I moved from Miami, Florida to Albuquerque, New Mexico, and during the road trip there, I made a stop and stayed in New Orleans. And as I was walking around by myself, as I have the tendency to do, I just think upon things, and I feel like partially that is a given because I'm a philosophy major, and if you're a philosopher, you don't think about things. I don't know what you're doing, but yeah, I was just walking around, and I don't know what I was looking at. Could have been like a skeleton piece of art, could have just been, one of those thoughts that just kind of just comes to you invasively. But I had the thought come to my head that the most common assumption that is had is that living guarantees death, and that became the first foundational thought, and I just worked the book from that main thought.
Okay, okay. And maybe I should have asked this first. Do you want to share a bit about more about your background or
Sure. So, so my background is, if we're talking in regards to academically and literarily, I am a graduate student in philosophy at the University of New Mexico. It's a continental program, so it's very much based upon sort of the poetic and literary side of philosophy, the less analytical side, less logical side. Not that that stuff isn't incorporated or included or known or taught or etc., but it really is nice to be in a program like that because it focuses on one of my strengths, which is literary writing, and I am a regularly published poet and short story writer with a variety of outlets. Too many to name off, but and I don't want to give preference to some over others for because I'm not making uh, a biography here for a or byline. But yeah, so that's my background. I am a student in philosophy, but also a literary writer. And in my own work, I try to do my darndest to incorporate the two together to make a cohesive, to make cohesive philosophical works.
okay, nice. There was on the Amazon page, I saw that you were nominated for a prize. You want to share a bit about that?
Well, actually, the way it's on the Amazon page, it's the person who did the review that was nominated for the prize. However, my publisher is nominating me for the exact same prize, which is a pushcart prize. And they're nominating one of the essays in the book called "Guilt is a Pleasure." And so yeah, that's it's very nice. I'll figure out in November of 2023 if I've actually received the prize. It's a very competitive prize. A select number of publishers each get to choose one work to submit for the prize from their publication. And so my publisher chose one of my pieces to be submitted for the Pushcart Prize also. So it's quite an honor to have that, and it was so wonderful that someone who's been nominated for the prize also was took a liking to my book and was willing to give such a incredible back cover review and statement.
Well, that's awesome, man. Uh, in your if you're gonna give a speech or something one day, you got to mention this interview.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mention things very
No, you know,
vaguely because like I've been so lucky to have so many people in my life that are good
yeah, I'm
to
joking.
me. I mean, my acknowledgments in the front of my book are very general. They say to my family and friends because I thought about like picking specific people or family, but I I realized that that would be too selective, and there were so many people I wanted to thank and be helpful, you know. And in the process of this book also, so interviews like this have been extremely helpful and kind, and you know, my publisher's been helpful, friends and family have been helpful, book review. It's just so, and it's and this being my very first book, it's been interesting learning the process and becoming ingrained into the process, and yeah, it's just been interesting process. And you know, it's one of those things where often a lot of people, you know, assume like, oh, they got their first book out, life changes, it's completely different, but it's like it just becomes a part of the normalcy and the routine, but it's a very nice part of that normalcy and routine.
Honestly, man, your book really brings like insights. You know what it is? You know how you look at an object and you see
Hmm.
it from one angle,
Hmm.
and then you can look at it from other angles and kind of get a new perspective. I
Hmm.
really felt that when I was reading your book.
Thank you.
So, did you always want to be an author, or was that something that can you share a bit about like
Yeah.
your writing process and all of this? Like, how did that happen?
Yeah, I mean, those are two separate questions. I'll answer them both in order. So, what got me into writing, funny enough,
Sure.
was when I was a little kid, like in middle school, I was just starting to watch adult animation. Um, and I looked at the credits and I saw writer in the credits, and I'm like, oh shit, there's someone that just solely focuses on like writing the jokes and the plot, and like that's a thing, right? And I decided for a little bit like I want to be an adult animation writer. So it stemmed from like me just practicing writing out like not correctly formatted scripts at all, like you know, nothing good, they're just absolutely just garbage adult film animation script ideas, and then it just went obviously in a completely different direction in regards to the writing stuff. But I think the philosophical elements were always there because my mom told me, and you know, obviously, I think this to be true, especially since she's a speech pathologist. I had a language disorder growing up, but I learned to read before I could speak, and I learned to read quicker than my sister did, who's quite intelligent herself. She's also in a master's program in speech pathology. And so I've just always had this love for reading and reading a variety of works. You know, the first big things I got introduced to as a kid were paleontology and geography, and philosophy is a slightly different direction from those, but I try to be as absorbing of knowledge as possible. And that kind of also imbues into my writing process because I think for me, what I try to do is I have this understanding that you read way more than you write. You read a little bit of everything. And then in terms of what you write, it's just little things that come to you and you get them down, right? So my process is literally like read a lot, then I go for a hike, I think a lot, and then I come back after thinking upon maybe something I've read, maybe just thinking about something in general random. And then if I get like a little snippet, right, of something that's good, I just pull that and put it down, right? Because typically how I see it is that um, a good writer should be a brutal reductionist editor. Like a good writer should be their harshest editorial critic.
Right. Right. Okay. So, and can you share a bit of insight in I mean, you shared a bit of insight of the writing process.
Mhm.
So you go into the hike, and then how much of the book you personally feel is like based on your experiences, or are you like,
No,
is it
it's
more a critique
yeah,
you
so
find?
the way I mean I don't necessarily have to go on a hike. It's not necessarily mandatory, although it happens often where, you know, hikes and walks are the best thing. It could even be walking through a town. It could literally just be sitting by myself watching like it doesn't matter. It just comes when it comes. But in terms of what I like to go for and what I tend to go for in the future, I like to take a sledgehammer to assumptions, right? I think that's something I want to stick with, and I think that's something very important because I think when you take a sledgehammer to assumptions, you realize that that's not the only that how do I want to put it? Like that all understandings are shatterable. All understandings are not the way to go. And once you realize that that's not the only way to go, you can realize that there are other ways to go, right? Because I think, um, especially with the assumption of death being such a strong assumption that the living are going to die and that's a guarantee, I think that closes off a lot of possibilities, understandings, explorations, and really, really obviously affects one's existence to quite a dramatic degree.
Right, right. You know the thing about death that I've noticed is that for a lot of people it's a forbidden concept.
Mm-hmm.
Like some cultures they don't talk about it. And at the same time there's a sense of fear like behind it, you know? Like I
Yeah.
remember when I was growing up in Iran, whenever there was the concept, like whenever somebody had died or something, it's so Iran's more like an Islamic, theocracy.
Mm-hmm.
So people would start saying religious prayers, right? It's as if it's something very intense and
Mm-hmm.
forbidden that they don't know what to do, so they try to connect. So what is your view on death being like a forbidden thing? You
I
know,
mean,
like
I
how,
don't.
because I've noticed you have a comfort in talking about it, right? So that's
Yeah,
interesting.
yeah. It's not that I have comfort necessarily in talking about it. It's more. I mean, it's more taking it like Zhuangzi took it, and that's taking it as it is for what it is, when it is, where it is, right? Unlike Zhuangzi, though, Zhuangzi assumes death is like the seasons, where it's gonna come cyclically and as an inevitable necessity. Whereas me, like, I see death as a part of life, but I don't see it as a necessary part of life, right? Like I mean, this may be a weird comparison, but I see death more akin to Oreos, right? You can have Oreos or you can't have Oreos, but I don't necessarily know if like life doesn't necessitate Oreos, and I don't know if life necessitates death either.
Okay. So I guess maybe we can go to this question,
Mhm.
where how would you define death, right?
So
And do you see it as a sort of duality? Do you see it that it's like dependent on life, or is it how do you see it?
Oh yeah, death is definitely dependent on life. I write in the text that death is prisoner to life, right? Like death is very much captured by life,
Right,
right?
right.
Like life can exist without death perpetually. Like life can be defined without death. That's just something we can do because we do it all the time. Like you're not death right now. And the way I view death is I view it very much in the same way that I view it as almost this wiping out of existence, right? That death is just the elimination of existence.
You know, I guess I had this question for later on, but I think
Mhm.
now's a good time to ask it.
Yeah,
Um, how do you find like the religious perspective, right, where they're considering an afterlife? Do you know what I'm saying?
yeah. I mean,
Like, how do you see that notion of that means they for them it's as if they don't it's there's a continuity, right?
yeah. I mean, I certainly see it as a possibility. I don't know how high or low the possibility is, but that's all I can say about that, right? I don't. I mean, I'm more doubtful that it's any specific religion's conception, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that can't be right either. Who knows? Maybe the Mormons are right somehow, right? That that there's no hell and there's this seven-layered heaven, and if you're the top tier Mormon, you get to be a god of your own planet. That could be possible, but again, these things are based upon likeliness. But the thing is that a lot of these religious individuals who believe in an afterlife, they still see immortality as necessitating death, right? Like, you have to die on this earth in order to have this immortal afterlife, right? So it's like they have this weird conception where it's like they're not bound by the assumption of death, but they're simultaneously bound by the assumption of death in a very, very weird and contradictory way, right? And so, um, and this is kind of why I use the term like death as the ceasing of existence, because if you exist in some way, you're present, and your existence is not gone.
Sorry, man. This was
You're good.
I was asking the question and this was on mute. I'm
Yes,
trying to like stop the background noise.
you're good.
So I was saying that you have this very interesting passage, right?
Mhm.
Where it's like you pose this question, where are the immortals? Right?
Yeah,
And you correlate immortality to the assumption of death. I'd love to hear more about that.
yeah, because I mean the obviously like if the assumption of death is not true, therefore immortality is necessitated, right? Because if you don't die, you live forever, and living forever is immortality. And but it's not necessarily even the fact that like you have to have a strict immortal. It's that the assumption of death is shattered if there's the possibility of immortality, right? Because if living guarantees death has to be shattered. It's not that like living has to go on. It's that like the guarantee has to be shattered, right? And so even the possibility of it can shatter it if the possibility is proven as true in any form or capacity. And so, but obviously, one of the easiest ways to shatter that assumption of death is to find something immortal or to find someone immortal. Just to find living immortality in possibility or actuality.
So, this brings this question to my mind
Mm-hmm.
that if, for example, like you're saying, like if we have this view, there's death, there's an ending, and then there's like, let's say, immortality. This
Mm-hmm.
kind of turns death into like this hollow assumption, right? Now, how would you see it in regards to like this? Is there an assumption to life? Do you feel that the same way we're viewing, let's say, an assumption like that death is an assumption, could there be a similar view for life, that life is an assumption?
Well, okay, I'll answer the first part about that. Like, I don't think that death is necessarily a hollow assumption, right? I think it doesn't matter how well grounded or ungrounded it is, it's still a assumption. But if you're getting to my honest opinion about how well grounded it is, it's extremely well grounded, right? Like pretty much, it's very hard to find someone that like has not died, that lives forever, right? Or has not died in some capacity, right? And like,
Yeah.
right, it's really difficult, right? However, that depends on how you define death, right? So this is why it also depends on how you use death, right? And so being poetic in my text with death allows it to touch upon all things. I don't think everyone's going to share my definition of death, right? So I want to be open-ended with it. My personal understanding is that even if someone is in the freaking grave, they're not dead because of their legacy, right? And that legacy is a matter of impact, right? So once one has impacted, they will have always impacted. Therefore, they will always, right? Because again, like, and this includes everyone, right? And every living thing that has had intentional impact, right? So, a panther, because it makes steps upon the ground, will always, have impacted. Therefore, will always, right? Be and
Right,
exist in
right.
some capacity. So, in regards to the assumption of life, assuming that we live, I mean, I think that's even more well grounded because, I mean, I think one of the main questions of metaphysics is why is there something rather than nothing? And it's not really like a controversial question to ask in metaphysics because we can assume there is a something. There are things, right? Maybe we're assuming we're things, but even if it definitionally, like it's really hard to counter that there isn't something, right? So if we're counting life as a something that has intentionality, um, yeah, I'm sure there's at least one example of it, and as shown by Descartes. So
Right, right. You go into a good point, right? Where you know how like how would I say this? It's like sometimes when I look at things, I notice that everything pretty much has a concept and context to it, right? For example, death is, we have the concept there. Now the context is suggesting what it means,
Hmm.
right? If you're a religious person, you feel death is like you're going to resurrect after death and then there's going to be judgment, right?
Yeah,
If you were like a yogi, you feel like there's reincarnation. So it's like their context is like, okay, I'm an eternal being and I'm just transitioning, right?
yeah.
So maybe a good question to ask is that um, I don't know how to ask it to be honest.
Well, I guess
But
I
in regards to, okay, go on, go on.
oh yeah, no, if to gather something from that, this book does also state, even though I have my own definitions of death, I think all assumptions of death, like whatever, however you define death, again, I think they're all assumptive, right? So I think the yogi is assuming, and the true religious person, right, are making the same assumption that their earthly body cannot be immortal, right? That like that earthly death is a necessity, right? So they're making an assumption of death. I don't think they're making the assumption of death, but they're making an assumption, right? And that all assumptions of like that even like for example, even Nietzsche's eternal recurrence includes having to die and then live again, right? So a lot of there's a lot of assumptions surrounding death, right? Even the fear of death, as you mentioned in the very beginning, like as death is something to be feared rather than accepted, right? So I try to touch upon as many of those understandings as possible to have people realize like, hey, we're assuming in a lot of directions. Preferably, um, I am one of those people that thinks that the best shot we should take at immortality is earthly immortality because the rest is just a promise that we shouldn't hedge all of our bets on. But I do think that given legacy that we are already immortal and do not realize it because we have a not a misunderstanding of what legacy is, but I think we look at legacy in the wrong way.
Right. There's a passage you have in the book,
Hmm.
which is I thought this was brilliant actually, where it's called, the title is Sunrise to Sundown,
Hmm.
right? Where you say every day is a suicide, living anyways is a do and die, sunrise I get inside, sundown I end the ride. First of all, man, poetically that's excellent. Yeah.
Yeah.
But in regards to sleep, right? Like
Mhm.
if I could just say a bit more about
Mhm.
this, right?
Yeah.
So this is I think one of the biggest like points about your book, at least something that was really significant for me, that
Hmm.
every night we go to sleep, right? And it's like an absence, like there's
Hmm.
nothing there. And then we wake up and we don't have the same fear that we would have for death.
Hmm.
Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So it's like, I guess the question would be, what is the relationship between absence and death?
Yeah. I mean, there's
If you can share a bit more about
yeah. I mean, there's a recent clip from one of the Wolfenstein games I came across where one of the characters is talking about um how death is just the absence of consciousness, and we do this every night. And so this woman would try to keep herself awake for as long as possible to keep her current consciousness around because each time you fell asleep, it would erase that existence, and then when you woke up, it was just an illusion of continuity, right? It's almost very Buddhist in a odd way. Although the Buddhists would say that every instant is an illusion of continuity. Well, not maybe not every Buddhist, but certainly many would. Um,
it.
but
Right.
I think that's the problem is that, and as you said earlier, like I don't think there's ever a totalizing absence, right? Even that continuity, you exist in some way. You exist as a illusory continuity in the Buddhist sense, but you still exist nonetheless. So yeah, I mean, I would say death is just complete absence of anything and everything that can be defined as you.
Ah, okay. Defined as you.
Yeah.
Now, a follow-up question to this. Actually, one of the questions I have here is that, let me find it. If the self dies, does the assumption of self uh, die as well? Right?
Well, it depends
Okay,
on.
let me see how I can form
Oh,
this.
sorry.
Um, let's say there's death, Okay. Or let's say that even if we look at life, we say who is alive,
Hmm.
then there's a sense of self, right? A sense
Yeah.
of self that is energy dependent, right? Now, if that sense of self isn't there, what does that imply about life and death? So I want to get your view on how do you see the concept of self when
Well,
it comes to both life and death?
well, I see the concept of self not in terms of life. I see it the concept of self as categorical, right? That the self is a categorization and can be expanded as vastly or minutely as one categorizes. So a good example of this is someone who's like an ardent and true pantheist, right? Who thinks the universe is one and all is the universe, right? So therefore, their self, because they would be part of that universe, that cosmic self, even their self would extend to the entire cosmos, as opposed to, let's say, someone in a monastic tradition. Potentially they would view the self as just one soul slash one's essence, and the self is like everything, even their body, even their their thoughts, like are not themselves. So yeah, I think the self is a very categorical thing. I don't know if it's necessarily rigidly tied down to anything. It's like you could point at something like, aha, that is a self, or this is myself. No, it's very categorical. I mean, look at the language you use. Depending on what possessions one owns, but my house, my car, talking about my book, right? Like it's like very categorical self based upon categorization. There's no strict essentializing self. There is what we categorize as ourselves.
In regards to levels to life, can you share a bit
Hmm.
more about that? So, for example, for yourself, do you
Hmm.
just see it on like some schools of thought? It's just materialistic perspective.
Hmm.
Okay, you're pretty much an object that's held together, and then this object breaks, and then there's nothing,
Right.
right? But if do you see additional levels, like for example, Rene Descartes' mind-body dualism?
Hmm.
As if there's another dimension where there's, I guess this goes back to consciousness, right?
Yeah.
How many levels do you see the awareness or consciousness? Anyways, I think you got the question.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think some things are more conscious than others. However, one of the brutal mistakes I think we make is that we assume a lot of things don't have consciousness. No, I'm not going to go as far as a panpsychist. I think that's a little much. I think we could definitely show
Right.
something as conscious that has uh, impact intentionality, right? So I would even argue that like a virus, for example, has a mind. Well, what the fuck do you mean by that? Well, a virus has to be able to have the ability to distinguish things that aren't itself and that like has to be able to pinpoint certain cells, right? A virus has to be able to like has to I don't want to say no necessarily, but fuck it, I'll say no because it works here in a sense. Has to know that like it's attaching onto a cell, right? Like it has intentionality, it has impactful intentionality, therefore it has a mind in the most basic of forms, right? So yeah, I think the thing here is that like but then is a virus aware of its own existence? Is a virus conscious and aware that like aha, I am an existing thing that exists? Well, no, I wouldn't go that far. However, I would assume so with a dolphin or an elephant because I see them act in certain ways of like brotherhood, companionship, or even the fact that dolphins will commit suicide at certain times, that elephants will mourn the dead. Like I think they have, just based upon limited evidence, of course, and a lot of biologists would say I'm over anthropomorphizing, but I think biologists even under anthropomorphize quite often. That yeah, that a lot of organisms have a level of consciousness, and assume um, I don't assume human consciousness is like the peak of consciousness because like I don't know what the hell I doubt that we have the maximal awareness of our existence, but but that's all it comes down to. Like consciousness is just a matter of like, aha, yes, I exist. I know I exist. Here I am, me existing. I'm an existing thing, right? It's just being aware that the existence is a thing and that you are a thing that exists within the existence that you have.
So this opens up something very interesting, right? So first I was thinking like, okay, let's say we in the future they create a robot that like behaves identical to a human being,
Hmm.
right? So if somebody looks at that robot, they'd be like, yo, it looks alive, right?
Hmm.
But it's not like I'm trying to think of the relationship here of like intelligence, memory, and really what is the exact definition of life where the assumption of death comes from. Can you
Yeah,
share a
yeah.
bit
Oh,
about that?
I get what you're asking. So I guess the robot's a good example, right? So are we assuming that the robot is intelligent but has no memory and no consciousness, or like what are the conditions of the robot?
I'm saying it more in the sense of like, how do we define what is alive, right? Because a
Yes.
robot can appear alive. Let's say in the future they have clones or something. I mean, a clone's not specifically a robot, but you know what I mean,
Yeah.
right?
So
It's as
I
if
would.
for some people in some traditions, there's a soul or free will, right?
Yeah.
It's as if something that has a sort of free will is like truly alive,
Yeah. So
right?
actually, I kind of.
Anyways, go
No,
on.
no, no. I actually pretty closely agree to that. So, um, in biology, right? If we're talking purely biologically, the definition for life is very like it's not very rigid, but I would argue that anything that's alive acts with intentionality, right? A table is not alive because it does not act with intention. A rock is not alive because it does not act with intention, right? Your pen, etc., right? So a virus, however, does act with intentionality. A bacteria acts with intentionality. A cell acts with intentionality. A panther, an elephant, a bee, we can go on. So I think the intentionality is like what distinguishes life. It has to have the ability to act with intent, right? So a robot, depending on how you design it, right? If you design a robot that has no intent, right? It has like because intent obviously comes with like you want to. It comes with a free will to it. If a robot is not able to carry out functions be like by its own wants, desires, will, then it's not alive. However, if you're able to make a mechanism that is able to act with intent, whether it could even be an unintelligent robot that lacks memory, it would still be alive. Because again, viruses don't have memory. Viruses aren't very intelligent, but we would call them alive.
Right, right. Um, it's just that for me, I'm constantly going back to this notion of like, okay, where's the starting point of the meaning of something,
Mm-hmm.
right? So when I think about death, it's as if like it's life and there's an experiential level to it, but
Mm-hmm.
there is also like this view that it's like, how would I say it? It's like, okay, let me share it like this. I don't know if you know who Shiv Prabhupada is, but he's
Mm-hmm.
this guy who started the Hare Krishna movement,
Mm-hmm.
right? And he has this view that we are like this eternal being,
Mm-hmm.
right? And people ask him about reincarnation, okay? And he's like, look at your own body from just like how a person changes their clothes, right? Like their whole body changes throughout their life, right? So it's as if even though there is like something that's alive and it's changing, that still doesn't consider like change is not death. I don't know if this is
Yeah.
making sense to you,
No, 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 that makes
what I'm
sense.
saying. But what is your view on in regards to that? Could the definition of death not be death? This is like
Well,
probably a
actually, that's
bizarre
no. I'm
question.
glad you bring that up because I have a passage, and I'm specifically um, referencing Heidegger, who let's see if I will find it really quick. I apologize. This is definitely a pause area. Where the hell is it? I know it's like way back here. Is
Let
blank
me see if I
stare?
can find it for you.
Yeah, yeah, because I'm using the
It's
physical
page
book.
41.
Page 40. Oh, I thought it was much later. I don't know why my brain thought it was much later. But actually, I'm glad I put it relatively
Yeah.
early then.
On the PDF, it's page 51.
Oh, on the PDF, it's
You
51.
know,
Ah, here it is.
so
Yes, yes, yes. All right, cool. Martin Heidegger does not assume that everybody dies. But in order to do this, Heidegger had to redefine death, calling what is colloquially referred to as death instead as demise. Heidegger does assume that everybody demises. This assumption of demise is simply a semantic rewording of the assumption of death. Those who evade the assumption of death through redefinition are only playing themselves. right? So I personally think, right, that when we come down to this idea of death isn't change, like, but then he's almost simultaneously saying, everything's a change. Yes, you change your clothing, like, it also depends on like how you define change, right? And we're getting into like semantics here. At that point,
Mhm.
what's most important is that and you were talking earlier about death being impactful to people, right? Like they give prayers, or even in the case of Zhuangzi, who came out very stoically. He tells his friend at first he was weeping and sobbing, and then he's seen later just banging a drum and like almost singing, right? But like trying to hide it. So he's like going through this whirlwind of emotions, but still is able to deliver something that's very almost a stoic sort of statement about death. But the point being, it's like we can call death all of these sorts of things, and like it's not a change, it's not right, but like we know it's impactful, we know it is there, and like we know it occurs in some capacity if it does occur, right? And so it's one of these things where it's like where we don't really have what's the word I'm looking for? An agreement upon what death is, right? So, and that's one of the other assumptions that comes down to it's like we don't have a really good common set definition of death, and like anyone who has died can't tell us what that is like. And also, if we're going to what Blanchot says, we don't even get to have death, right? Like so, there's so much sway and pull in these directions, and I think what's most important is like to not get caught up on like what death is. I think what's more pressing and more important is to get caught up upon what life is. And I know that may sound silly from someone who wrote an entire book on death, but I don't think we can like move into life properly until we get past death, until we see ourselves as those that can defeat death in a sense.
Right. So, Anthony, if it's okay, we
Yeah,
have like a quick break. I'm just gonna run to the bathroom real
yeah, of
quick, and
course.
I'll be back.
Yeah,
Okay,
of
man.
course, man.
All right. So hang in there. I'll be back.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you. You can be heard.
Nice.
But yeah, was that the last of
Yeah,
your
man.
questions?
Hopefully, no, no, there's more.
Okay, cool. Let's just jump into them.
Yeah, yeah. I'm just getting settled here.
Yeah, Craig. I hope you're doing a good job getting
Okay.
all this.
All right.
I'll fight Craig otherwise.
So, here's the. Bro, I'm just visualizing you like punching your computer, your laptop,
Fuck you!
just
Fuck you,
destroying your
Craig! Fuck
laptop.
you, Craig!
All right. Okay, let's keep going.
Of course.
Let's not leave the headspace. Okay.
Yeah.
So, okay, let's talk about guilt, and then I got a question more focused around culture
Of
afterwards.
course.
So let me find your entry here. Or here, let me ask this.
I found it.
What role do? Oh, you found it. Okay.
Would you?
Okay, let me start from this. So I've noticed something. I want to get your view on this, right? That for a lot of people, like when they become emotional, their rationality goes away, right? So it's as if there's a person looking at a situation rationally, and then when they get scared or when some emotion comes to them, right, then they kind of lock down on a certain idea. Do you know what I'm saying? So it's as if so when you're saying the assumption of death, what role do emotions play in there?
Well,
That's pretty much the question.
yeah,
And
I
then we'll
think.
dive into guilt.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest emotions at play is obviously fear and uncertainty. I think these are the biggest and most obvious understandings that come through with death. But one of the other things that also steps in is confusion. I think death is one of those things because it's unknown and uncertain. Like it elicits a lot of various responses, right? Some people are captivated by it, right? So I don't know if you could say that like death elicits one set of emotions, right? Melancholy is set it, depression is set it, even joy, right? Like some people celebrate the death of certain people. Like I remember, being that my background is one of my quote unquote backgrounds, whatever you want to call it, all arbitrary, but it's Cuban. Like there were a lot of Cubans who were celebrating the death of Fidel Castro. So, death is one of these things. Like there's no one set of emotions that it necessitates eliciting. But it just seems to be one of those things where like certain emotional expectations are imbued into it.
Right. The thing I think about is that for a lot of people it's okay. Let me ask this, right? Do you remember that question I asked about the levels to life you see, right?
Yes.
So sometimes I get the feeling that because people haven't died, it isn't real for them, right? So they have kind of no choice other than to assume it, right? So, and then emotions come in, and then they lock down on their on their assumption of death.
Yeah.
Right. So how is it? Are you saying that everybody has no choice? Is there a choice when it comes to the assumption of death? I guess that would be the question.
Yeah, I mean, so I view all knowledge as a matter of faith, and faith is a matter of trust, and and faith is like an unyielding trust. So it's like, so you can choose to have trust in or knowledge, quote unquote, in death, right? Yes, I have knowledge of death, right? That's a choice to put that trust in that direction, right? And you could obviously say like, well, no, I have faith or knowledge, trust in these things based on evidence, right? But again, you choose what things matter to you as like evidence, right? You choose what is or is not convincing to you. So yeah, I do entirely think that the assumption that it's entirely a choice. That doesn't mean it's not a highly influenced choice. That doesn't mean like a lot of people don't try to like be convincing of it, but at the end of the day, to take on any assumption is a choice because all matters of knowledge are matters of faith.
Right. So tell me this, and we'll go to guilt at some point. But tell me this:
Don't feel guilty
if
about
a
it.
person now I'm going to feel guilty, bro. Now that you said but oh man, the question I was going to ask, it just skipped my mind, bro, when I laughed.
Oh no. Was the last thing we were talking about knowledge as a matter of faith?
Yeah, it for some reason it skipped my mind. But anyways, here I was thinking of in regards to, okay, so there's something that in my personal talks online, I talk about how there's inner relationship with life and an outer relationship with life, right? So the outer relationship, it's as if like people see that people die, and if they identify with the body, it's over, right?
Yeah.
But do you have a sort of categorization like that? Do you see a sort of inner life? For example, there are these people called the Sufis, right?
Yeah.
I'm sure you're aware of them.
Like Ibn Arabi
And they have
would be a
this-
good example. Like I very much
Yeah,
like
yeah.
Ibn
For
Arabi is
example-
one of my favorites, of the Sufis.
Right. There's these major poets, these Persian poets by the name of Hafez, Attar, and what's the other one's name? Rumi, right?
Yes.
And they have this concept which is huge, where they say to die before you die.
Yes.
Right? Now, I think this kind of connects to guilt and emotions, right? That means it's as if like, what is dying before death? I don't know. It's like, do you have some insight into this you can share?
What's the line from Rumi about the serpent, right? Like you like the Serpent of Time or something. I'm not going to recall the poem super well, but yeah, Rumi is just an absolutely brilliant writer on death, and like I wish I could have included her reference to him, but the thing with like it's just like I would have nothing to add, right? Like the problem, like I can't really cite Rumi because like he already says so much and so beautiful. So it's like it's like it's one of those things where it's like I have nothing else to say. You said everything. I would just literally just be like stealing something you said. Yeah.
No. I'm pretty much saying like the concept of an inner and outer
No,
death.
so
If you
that's
could
what I was
share
getting
insight
to.
on that.
Right. No.
Oh, okay, go
That
on,
is
go
what I
on.
was getting to. But I think Rumi like writes beautifully on death. And so I'm glad you brought him up and like the concept of inner and outer, because the thing is that like I don't view our inner existence as separate from our outer existence, or our outer existence separate from our inner existence, whatever those things mean, right? Like because again, the mind is part of the body is part of the mind, right? Like these things are attached to a degree, and like okay, but then your mind and body is attached to, let's say, the laws of physics, right? Like and the laws of physics are attached to the cosmos, right? Like I think systems are too interconnected to necessarily be like inherently ripped apart from each other. We can focus on things and hone in on aspects, very Ibn Arabi style, where it's like, yes, there's this unity of being, and then all things that exist are just aspects of the greater, larger Allah. And I think that's more what we do. Like this is why I like Ibn Arabi a lot, because I do think that there is a unity of being. However, I think there is still levels of distinctness to the aspects that we can look at, right? So these things, things cannot avoid a level of interconnection. I mean, we all exist in the same cosmos, assuming, right? And I think that's not, again, it's still an assumption, but I think it's a relatively safe assumption. And yeah, we can hone in on, like, I could look at my pillow and I could just hone in on, like, there's my pillow over there that has pillow nest, but like that pillow doesn't exist separate from, as oddly as it sounds, thermodynamics or gravity, or these things that tie and connect us all. So yeah, I really don't see what one would even mean by an outer and inner life. I think creating an outer and inner life is almost creating creating inherent categories where inherency does not lie.
Right. So rather than saying two sides of a coin, you're just saying it's one coin. It's you can't separate the sides.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah,
Something like that. You're saying.
yeah. Or actually, here's how I like to view it, right? Because given my very Taoist tendencies or Heraclitean tendencies, right? Like try to separate the water from the river. Right, like that you don't
Okay.
like they exist inherently because of each other, right? Like you can't have a river without water, and like that just doesn't make any sense. And you can't just grab some water and be like, aha, I now have the river. Like, no, you have water. So it's like it's a greater mass. Like, yes, you can pull some water out of it and look at that specific bit of water, but that bit of water isn't going to tell you about the whole river.
Right. You know why I was asking that? Because I was thinking about, like, for example, people who've gone into a coma, or people who, for example, have become like are in a vegetable state, right? It's as if, like, in the outer realms, in their outer view, it's kind of like they're not present. Do you know what I'm saying? But it's kind of like people assume, okay, their brain's still working. They're like internally they're alive. Right,
Yeah,
externally
they have
they're kind of like close to. Go on.
Yeah, they would have, I would say, mental intentionality, right? Like if someone could still act with intentionality in their mind, they're still alive. Right, so it's not a bad assumption to make, right? Like where comatose people are alive, because I think it's one of the areas where we actually make a good assumption there, because mental intentionality is highly important, right? Because especially like a lot of there's witches I know, and they act with a lot of mental intentionality, or like even people who lucidly, and yeah, that still is a big form of intentionality.
Right. Let me share a bit more.
Right.
Okay. That's kind of where. Do you know? Do you know what? Right. That means if your attention is you're alive. If there, I don't know. Is this coming across?
Uh, I mean, okay, like, I mean, let's say you get like right? So it's like, the guy who shot you will always shot you as he did, right? And so, yeah, so I think like you know, uh, that's just how I see it. Like I still see large
I mean,
intentionality there.
maybe this is a mistake on my part because you define death as being like the end of the physical component
No,
to
not
reality,
necessarily.
right? And you said that you don't see. Oh, okay,
No, I don't see
okay.
that at all. I don't see
So,
death. I see death as the end of existence, but existence doesn't necessarily have to be a physical present existence. Like existence could be ethereal. I'm literally arguing that like even like your past self exists in some way, but you're not physically there in the past, right? But it always will exist in some way. So it's like, no, I don't view life as the
okay,
physical material necessarily. I view just life as an existence with intentionality.
right, right.
Even if that's a past intentionality,
Okay,
even a former intentionality is still an existent intentionality.
okay. I guess this would be a good time to go to guilt. The
Sure.
guilt's kind of like crushing me inside.
Yeah, that's fair.
you know, but if I don't ask this question, I'll feel guilty. So, okay. So you have this very nice passage on guilt, but rather than reading it, you say, how would you connect guilt, to this whole psychology of the assumption of death? Maybe we can get into this.
Yeah, because I think it's important that let's say immortality, if immortality is a thing, right? Because I'll be not as blatant as I have in other parts. Then guilt becomes even more important, right? Because that means you will always live with your guilt, right? So it's more important to the matters of immortality in this book rather than the matters of death in this book. Because if death is a thing, we don't have to worry about guilt as much. You're done, right? Your guilt will eventually end. But if you are immortal in any way, your guilt will always be there. Therefore, it's quite important to address.
Okay. You bring up a crazy point. That means, for a second, I was thinking, okay, if everybody was immortal, right? So would they still be guilty or not, right? So the guilt is based on a sense of loss. So that means if there's no death or there's no like reaching a final absence, then there would be no guilt, right? Is that how you're viewing it?
No, not necessarily, because I don't think guilt is always based upon loss necessarily. I think quite often guilt is based upon like what we hate ourselves for doing. Obviously, of course, there's a lot of guilt and loss, but it's like guilt is often based upon like this. The way I see it is just like whipping ourselves pleasurably for the things we have or have not done.
But it is a good point you're saying that if it ends, then the guilt becomes kind of unnecessary, So it's more like
Yeah.
a psychological projection rather than
Well, it's not that it becomes unnecessary. I think guilt has a lot more weight if there is no death.
okay.
Yeah, so it's not the fact that like guilt. I think guilt is unnecessary no matter what. In the same way that I cite here, where I talk about guilt being like a druggie looking for a fix. Like drugs aren't necessary. I'm not saying they're wrongful. I'm not saying people like I'm not like a DEA motherfucker. But the thing is that like drugs are not necessary, nor is guilt a necessity, right? Like, I don't see. I mean, guilt is I see it as like, and I do in my passage obviously play upon the idea of guilty pleasure, But I think guilt is a pleasure, right? And I think it can be a harmful pleasure in the same way that drugs can be a harmful pleasure.
Okay. Another question I had for you was about the concept of death in culture, right?
Yes.
So I remember reading something about samurai. I think it was from the book of the samurai by Hagakure.
Hmm.
The book was called Hagakure by, I forget the guy's name, Tsunamoto, Yamamoto, something like that.
Yes.
And there was this view that the samurai, like from the beginning of the day, they would just try to visualize themselves dying, right? So the assumption, like they would try to see their death and then they would kind of get freed by it, right? So in regards to a cultural sense, how do you see that? How do you see the assumption of death? Does it have a value, or do you see it as unnecessary?
Like that I see death as unnecessary to culture.
Just pretty much like, how do you see the samurai having this view that for them death is like the most important thing, right? One of the most important things.
I mean, if
It's as
that's
if internally when they're dead, they have this courage to, in some sense, live.
yeah, I mean, again, if that's how they want to see it, I mean, knock themselves out. If you want to die, knock yourself out. Like that's not like again, I don't want to encourage people to, obviously, especially if they're suffering and anguish, but at a certain point, it's like you're like people who, you make that choice for yourself. I guess the thing I see about culture and death, and I do write about that, is that like it's a very common thing to have, like, what I would say is cultures of death, right? Who like focus on death, use death as a literary element, whatever. Like, death is just a common theme, right? But like, we don't really have a culture of immortality, and I think an argument can be made that like a culture of death has a lot of richness. Like, there's a lot of richness and beauty, and like, well, I mean, I clearly would agree with this, that like there's a lot of beauty and like poignancy that can be pulled from death as a theme, a topic, etc. And but I, however, see that there's a lot of potentiality and richness culturally and beauty to immortality, right? I think both of these themes have potential elements of richness, right? Whether there be the ugliness and beauty of death and the ugliness and richness of immortality. So I don't think one is superior as a cultural theme to the other. I think both provide a sort of richness, and you could even argue that the immortality provides more richness because it's ongoing, like it's rich in the sense of like there's excessively rich. Whereas death can be viewed as like horror in the sense of like because it comes to an end. Now, I would argue that like most cultural pieces that overstay their welcome are work, like they're just excessive, and so they're not like rich in the sense of being fulfilling. But again, there's that's more for cultural critics to argue than not. But yeah, I would like to see more pieces that touch upon the richness of immortality. I don't think we do enough of that as a culture, and not that I think like death has like played its part, or we've said everything that needs to be said about death, or death can't be used beautifully and should never be used or talked about again in culture. But I would like, I think often it's limited our scope of like what elements we can play with.
Right. Let me tell you how I'm approaching this. For me, it's like in this life, because there's the concept of change, there's like a start and then there's an ending. Now, if there was a culture where people were immortal, what would happen to their value system? Right? If there was like immortality and no assumption of death, would that be kind of like people would become like, believe it or not, like robots without emotions? So what happens if there is no sense of loss? Do you know what I'm saying here?
Well, I think here's the thing, right? Like,
How does it affect the person's value system if there is no ending or there is no death, right?
well, I think rather than answer the question straight up, I think I'm still going to answer the question, but more, I don't want to say sneakily, but like we could say the same thing already with death. Like we've talked about multiple times how like so many people view death in so many different ways and do so many different understandings. And so I think the same would go with immortality, right? Like I don't think there's like one definitive way that every organism would understand it. I think just like how we view death in a complicated, multifaceted way, I think the same would go with immortality, and it'd also be dependent on like what form of immortality are we talking about, like the form of immortality that I'm talking about quite often, which is immortality via legacy. Are we talking about like literal physical bodily immortality? Are we talking about heavenly immortality? Like, so, but again, no matter which one of those you pick, you could still view those in a myriad of directions.
I mean, I understand what you're saying. The perspective from culture, right, I had was that there was this Rumi story. I think it was Rumi or Hafez. And there's this guy, this Sufi goes to this marketplace and he says, people can't control death. And there's this old enlightened guy there where he just puts this cylindrical hat between his ear and this wall. And the guy consciously chooses and he leaves his, like, in the way it's written, it's like he leaves his body.
Yeah.
Right? As if he had this sort of not physical immortality, but such an inner sense of immortality where death was based on choice. Right? So yeah. I'm trying to get more of your perspective on like what would an immortal culture look like? Do you know?
Well, that's
that
the
means
thing.
What
like,
if tomorrow everybody realizes it's an assumption and it's like there's no death? What kind of world do you see?
Yeah, I mean, this is so speculative, and like any opinion I would give would be because I think I'm naturally an optimist. Not that I don't have pessimistic tendencies ever. I haven't had those moments, but like I think my base state is very optimistic. So I think any answer I could give would be very skewed by my optimism, right? And any like questions like would be just as speculative on my end as anyone else's, right? I just view myself as like opening up understandings and and I hope that leads people in interesting directions and discoveries, and that's all I can hope for, right? Like all I can hope is that my work can lead into insights and hopefully helpful insights, and that's all I can say. But figuring out yes, what would an immortal culture look like? Hates me, man. It's no idea there because it could go in so many different directions.
Right, but imagine like, so what kind of effect do you see? Let's say millions and millions of people or the whole planet like read your book, right? And they got insights that our assumptions on death are like too heavy, right? Or too serious, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm trying to see like what sort of change you would see if people get insights about the assumption of death, like culture.
I think this is the thing, right? Like I have directions, like based on my desires. Like those are two separate questions. What I think would happen and what I would hope for people to want to take from it, right? I mean, I've had people read my book and share like a lot of different thoughts. But I think the main thing for me is that no matter what, and I think this is true in both questions, is that I hope that this text, and I think this text, if taken seriously, will assist in assessing assumptions and like help people not reorientate their thinking necessarily, but like open up their thinking. And I think that's something I want to stress in my philosophy always. And I think that's something that this book comes with is it opens up thinking, right? It just gets people thinking and opening up their minds in various directions. So that's the only sort of guarantee I could have. I mean, again, I had a reviewer read this book, and the review was DNF or did not finish. This guy worships Satan. So obviously my book did not have that in there, right? Which I'm agnostic. I'm not a worshiper of Satan. I do use Satan as a figure of knowledge and immortality in here because, well, literarily he is all that. But I also give a lot of praise to the prophet Elijah in here also as a figure of immortality. So yeah, I think obviously just for the one reviewer who's not going to listen to this, like I'm going to clear that up with them. But yeah, but again, the larger point on that is that I care a lot about like open-mindedness and not shutting things down. And obviously that reviewer did not have that and read my book. But I think the majority of people who have read my book and reviewed it in earnest honesty have stated that that my work was good for creating, I guess, knowledge openness. So, and that's one of the things I hope for and glad has occurred.
Okay. You know, man, I have this view, right, that because human beings need a value system, life needs to have a purpose. Okay? And because it needs a purpose, the death is like a huge, like important part of it, right? And when I try to visualize, okay, if there was no death, if we were immortal beings, I feel that as a sort of destruction of the meaning of life, right? It would be as if we're just like endless sight. Do you know?
Yeah,
it's as if we've become just eyes. We become space, pretty much, like the eyes of space, right? And then I think about like the levels of the human being, right? There's like a personal level, like a person can die to themselves, right? For example, like Rumi and all these guys, right? A person's in a relationship, like a relationship can die, you know, a person can die to a group of people, right? Like the assumption of death is first of all like multidimensional. It has different dimensions, but at the same time, I feel it's necessary, right? So can you, I guess the question would be, what is it? How necessary do you see it being? Right?
Well,
Is it something that people should look into, or people should just be like, okay, it happens, I shouldn't think about it? Or even religious people, they're like, I'm immortal, why should I care? Do you know?
Okay,
like,
so
do you know what I'm saying? Like,
yeah. So going to the Rumi
I mean,
thing, right? Like, So when we go to the Rumi thing, right? I'll start with there, like, you know, like we die to ourselves, right? Like I don't like yeah, you can use death in that terms, but I feel like that's very similar to how Heidegger talks about death, and that's not like it's more poetic. Like that's not what death actually is. Like it's and again, I know it's odd for a poet to criticize poetry and poet philosophy, but nonetheless, like yes, it is death in a way, but it's not like the way of death, right? And I think the other thing of that, like, you know, I don't think immortality necessarily creates a lack of care. I mean, you can argue in some situations that, like, immortality would create greater care, right? Like, let's, you know, I'm going to very much assume, for I think, based upon, you know, what I'm going to call good science, quote unquote, and not like, you know, Ocasio-Cortez exaggerating. I mean, like, the actual, like, the climate, the ICCP or the congressional report given to Congress, right? It gets the greatest, quote unquote, I should say greatest, but renowned climate scientists in the United States, right? Like climate change is a thing. It's going to cause damages in the future, like just based on the best evidence we have. Is it going to end the world in 12 years? No, Ocasio-Cortez, that's not happening. But nonetheless, as a thing that's occurring, right? But a lot of people can say, well, I don't have to worry about that. I am going to die. However, if you're immortal, shit, you gotta be a cultivator of the earth, because if you're assuming bodily mortality in this case, but like I have to care, like I have to like I have to like take care of you. And the other thing is that like death literally, so going into like now all forms of death and existence, like death ends meaning. Like you're assuming that the end of meaning creates meaning. That's silly. Like the more like meaning is something created. It's at least the way I view it. I very much agree with how Camus is on inherent meaning, life meaning, you know, existential metaphysical meaning. That it's that we have to be agnostic about it, right? And being most nihilistic is to have absence. So yeah, I actually view these ideas of like we're going to die create further nihilism as opposed to that they create more meaning, right? You can be nihilistic about things because it's all going to end anyway. You hear a lot of people who claim to be nihilistic making that simple statement like, who cares, I'm going to die, who cares, it'll all be over anyways. Whereas opposed to someone that's immortal.
You know, what would this imply? That means it's like our view of it is like, you know, the opposite of death, right? So without death, how would you know of immortality?
Well, the way I view it is like this, right? Like, that statement is very much in regard to an assumptive death state, right? So if one enters, right, death, like if one comes to die, because I don't think I think there's many possibilities where immortality occurs, but death also can simultaneously occur, right? Like just because you can't immortal doesn't mean you're going to be immortal. So again, because I'm touching upon every avenue of how people try to think about this thing, but when you enter death, you are without death, right? Because you're absent from it. You're literally absent from death if you enter it. So therefore, you are without life, without death if you enter that plane, right? So you could take it that way if you're someone who's like tied into the assumption of death. Like this is a very good passage. However, the way I could view it is like the way I view it also like this in regards to opposing the assumption of death. It's like when you enter a plane that's without life in the sense that like you don't think about it as life. You exist, right? Like you're not because you're not thinking about these things relationally, right? You just are as you are. You're not thinking about these things as life. You're just kind of you're flowing almost through the Taoist river of existence, and therefore, because you're just flowing through existence, like you're without life in sort of like a conscious sense, and you're without death in a conscious sense. Is that like it's not on your mind, right? You're in a plane, you're in a state, you're in an understanding where these things aren't considered or impactful because you're just in the flow of the plane.
Right. So, one last question, man, if I can ask.
Thank you, man.
This.
I mean, not that this is.
Do you have?
Oh, I just want to say this has been a great discussion, and I'm sad for it to be over.
No, man. I hope it was good for you. You know, it's.
Dude, this has been great. For a first-time interviewer, you've been very welcoming, and I know I've interrupted a couple of times because I'm like, I can already answer the question. I don't want to lose it, so I apologize for doing that a couple of times. You've been very polite and kind.
No, man. You've actually like I was getting insights as you were talking about this. You know. So it's been a profound conversation for me. You know, it's like how often do I get to talk about death with someone? Do you know what I'm saying? So it's
awesome. Well, I'm glad you enjoyed yourself.
But the question I had, you know, so I'll say this. So in a lot of these Mr. Within talks I give, I'm trying to fathom and like I usually start from wondering about how the past viewed it, how the present is viewed it, and then after I've covered the past and the present, the future is left, right? And then I was thinking that I don't know if you have children, but if you had, do you have children?
No, I am a single man and a college student. Like I having kids right now too much. I live in a college dorm. It's just no.
Hey man, maybe after this interview things will change. You know.
Oh God, please no, please no. No.
Bro, the world's gonna know about you, you know.
Oh my God, yeah.
But okay,
I don't want my partner telling me right now, like, yeah, I'm pregnant. Like that's not right now. Please no, not ever. But not right now either. Just.
But here I'll get to the question. The question honestly was that so I'm thinking. Pretty much I think about like an advanced civilization and how they would treat the idea of death. But then I was thinking like, let's say you've become a father, right? And you have, let's say your son or daughter come up to you and ask you, what is death? Right? Like, how would you explain that? I think this is like one of those important questions where a lot of people are actually wondering about the answer.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the best way I can do it is, actually, I'm going to take that back, because I was going to say I would do it poetically, but actually, if, like, I could pick any method of doing it, right? And I think this is true. Like, I think the best work upon upon death that's ever been written is The Myth of Sisyphus by Camus. Obviously, that might be a little advanced for a kid, but right, that the Myth of Sisyphus is a work about the prevention of suicide. Right? Obviously, do I go that deep with a kid? No. But when getting asked about the question of death, I think it's most important to answer with life, right? Because at the end of the day, it's like in the myth of Sisyphus, well, in the actual myth of Sisyphus, right? Sisyphus gets condemned by the gods to roll a massive boulder up and down a hill. Every time he gets the boulder up the hill, it rolls down the hill, right? And he has to keep pushing it up again. And Camus says, like, this is how life and meaning works. And even though that life and meaning works in this very rough way, imagine Sisyphus happy, right? And I think the same thing can be said with death. It's like in the same way that you imagine happiness, and I use this passage in The Parrot and the Crow, imagine nothing. And that's the thing, it's not graspable. Right? Like, the dead don't imagine is the exact quote I use in here, right? Like, don't worry about imagining it. Imagine what your life is going to be like. Imagine how you're going to get that boulder up there. Imagine the peaks imagine how high of a peak you can reach with that, with the boulder of life, right? Imagine that because the dead don't imagine. And they can't imagine.
Right, so this is so profound. So, in other words, the concept of death is dead.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That means it's hollow until we see what happens. If we see what happens.
If we see what happens. But taking death to its most extreme, right? Because again, if you let's say you die in your body and all of a sudden you're in purgatory, the boulder is still being pushed. It's just being pushed somewhere else or in some other form or capacity, right? You're not dead. You're still capable of imagining and imbuing. So, yeah, I would argue that, like, the concept of death, if someone asked me what death is, like, death should be dead to us.
Wow. That's an incredible statement, man.
Thank you.
It's it's one of those things where I think if you say that to your son or daughter, they'd be like, "Okay, Dad, I'm gonna run away now."
Yeah, no, it's certainly something that, like, it's hard to tell a child, right? And it's obviously and I want to explain it longer because because I want to, because I am very, what's the word I'm looking for? I'm not one for, even though my writing is very brief, the way I speak is the opposite. So this is, I think, one of the psychological reasons I try to be a very brutal and reductionist editor with myself. But nonetheless, like, if I ever do have kids, which I at this moment don't plan on having, but if I do, like, that's how I explain it to them. It's like dead to us. Don't worry about it. There's no, like, you can't imagine it. The dead don't imagine. Like, just imagine what your life is going to be, right? Like, and go from there, right? Because that's what you have before you. And I think it's the most, and I think one of the things that's, like, why guilt is also mentioned here is because, people often feel guilty around death and surrounding death, but, like, I think it's most important to actually deal with this before you, right? Your legacy is a matter of, like, what's before you. It's not a matter of, like, what has been, because if you're living, your legacy is always before you. And so one of the things going back to an earlier question about what you want people to take away, I honestly want people to get a takeaway from this book and, like, focus more on living. I think people overly focus on death. Like, we're assuming shit. Like, stop. Just overcome death and focus on life. Like, and I think that's the thing I want people to take away. Is that what I think people are going to take away? No, they'll accuse me as being a Satan worshiper. But, that being said, that's how I see this. I see this as a book of, oddly enough, despite how it's covered, despite its title, despite its theme, I view this as a book of living and life rather than a work of death.
And one more question, actually, right? You have a passage where you say funerals are for the living, right? So, how do you see like funerals happening if this concept of death was kept in the unknown? Do you see that as a sort of is it like theatrics to you, like a funeral,
Oh,
or is it
well, actually, yeah. So the idea was actually grabbed from my abuela, and she literally said that exact phrase, like, Anthony, funerals are for the living. When I die, we shall have a party. Have a party. I want you to celebrate my life when I die, right?
nice?
Because she understood very clearly that, like, the dead are not present in the funeral. It's entirely ritualistic. It's entirely for living comfort, for living understanding, right? Like that's just what it's for and how it is for. And um and so yeah, I do view it entirely as a living ritual. That doesn't mean it's a bad thing. That doesn't mean it has meaning. That doesn't mean we should get rid of it. Like that's not. It's not any hate upon funerals. If anything, it just I think it because obviously I've talked about like how important I think life is, and so I think that imbues it with even more importance and more significance. That um, it's not just a present thing; it's also a physically present thing, which I do like physicality. I'm not like yes, I can see how I came off as a materialist earlier because I do like a sense of physicality. I like hiking. I like the physical aspects of things. But yeah, so that's kind of how I view that. So no harm, no foul in funerals. In fact, quite the opposite. Like I don't have a negative view of funerals. I have a viewpoint of that like they're for the living, they're for catharsis, and I do also think funerals should be more celebratory, right? Like I think the way Catholics do their funerals are just god awfully depressing and really don't get down to the core of like what people are.
Yeah, man. The fact that you said like to celebrate like the passage, or like when somebody dies for people to celebrate it. That's totally like the transformation of the assumption of death. I actually
Yeah,
think it's like it might strengthen people too. There's
yeah. I think
I want to share this quote with you. Okay, sorry, go on.
no. The last thing I was gonna say is like the thing that surprised me with the Catholics also is that like you think they would be celebratory because they assume that like when you die, if you're a good Christian, that you have union with God in this like eternal realm of paradise pleasure, however they view it. So it's like you think of all people groups, Catholics would be like extremely revelatory in death. So it just shows that they like people behave in very oddly contradictory ways in regards to death.
Right. The thing I wanted to share was this quote from, I think I'm butchering the guy's name, Chuck Planiak. Okay. But he has this quote where he says,
That I guess that's his name, Chocolate Planiac. It's close enough.
yeah, okay, he says, we all die. The goal isn't to live forever. The goal is to create something that will. Right? So, do you have any final remarks on this view that, it's if we create something, does that mean that we surpass death? If something that outlasts us, for example,
I'm
Albert
even
Camus
more.
has passed away, but his words are still alive, right? His ideas alive.
Well, I'm even more extreme in that regard. Like, I think the fact that like you exist with any intentionality, like, is like shows that you exist, right? I used the example earlier of a panther, like touching the ground, like choosing to leap, choosing to climb, choosing to crawl. It's not even a matter of creation. It's just a matter of like, that one's existence in of itself like will always have had like some sort of impact even if it's like not remembered, right? Because it's like because that's assuming the Banksy idea of legacy where it's like legacy is a matter of memory, like yes, I remember Camus because he wrote his work. Of course I think some people are going to have like more impact on others, right? I'm not saying like the panther jumping into the tree is as impactful as the invention of the nuclear bomb. Like no, these provide two very different impacts. Like, they cause greater impact to individuals, or to like how the planet is structured, or so on and so forth. But nonetheless, they're equivalent in the sense of that they always will have impact. They always remain in the sense of always remaining, and in the sense of always will having been. But of course, like, I'm gonna refer a lot more to Camus than I'm gonna refer to random mountain lion that I've never, seen, that's doing some shit over in the Sandias right now. Like, I mean, I don't know that mountain lion, and like less living things know that mountain lion, and people aren't thinking about that mountain lion as much as they're thinking about Camus. So, I mean, that's the most basic way I see that. So I think his quote is good, but I don't think it goes far enough.
Right. So, a final thing, where can people find you and more of your work?
Yeah, so, I mean, in terms of finding this book in particular, it can be found on Amazon, The Assumption of Death. It's the only place that can be purchased is on Amazon. My publisher solely does, they do distribution through Lulu also. So you could find it on Amazon, you could find it on Lulu, and that's where you can get it through paperback only. There's no PDF version, there's no Kindle version, there's no audiobook version. I may work on that, but as of right now, the only way to get this book is via paperback. It's a very short length. It's 66 pages. Most of the pages aren't even full pages, so it's something you could literally read in an afternoon if you want to rush through it, or you could take your time and read it reflexively. But it allows for a lot of that flexibility thanks to its brevity. In terms of finding me, I'm not really on social media at all. It's just not something I take, just personally don't care much for. But I can be found on Medium at Vernon 305, and if you want to read my other work, you could just Google my full name, and I'm the first result to come up, and excuse me, various poems and short stories will come up if you just Google my full name. But yeah, thank you so much for letting me shout myself out like that. It's always the most awkward and part I hate the most.
No worries, man. This has honestly been awesome, and I wanted to actually get any final thoughts you feel that you want to share. Let's say in the future generations get to hear what you have to say. Any final statements or thoughts before we end this?
One of the things about, because this is about future generations, I just don't think of myself in those terms, right? Like, I'm not like Nietzsche, who's like, yes, this is for the philosophers of the future. Like, nah, man, for me, as you can tell, the thing I like the most, I just like talking shit, and it could be about whatever. It could be about sports, it could be about philosophy, whatever. But, so I think my final thoughts really are just like, just go and do shit, man. Live your life, go do shit, try out things, obviously within safety, don't hurt other people and shit like that. But I think the big takeaway is that really, I would recommend, just from personally, because it's been helpful for me, just live a rich life, and you'll be all the more rewarded for doing so.
Awesome, man. I'll share this. One thing I took away from you is that honestly, the more a person actually lives, the more their view on death will change. Right? So actually, even though your book's on death, I think it's inspiring people to really look at life more deeper, which I think that's incredible. So definitely great job, and thanks for doing this interview.
Dude, thanks for doing this with me mutually. Dude, this is, again, as I think I may have said in the email, having a book out, one of the best things about having a book out is it's a good excuse to just talk to people you haven't talked to before and have interesting conversations. So this has been very nice.
And okay, let me turn off the recording here. Let me kick out Craig. Craig is
Bye, Craig. Get the hell out of here, Craig.